During my mother's funeral, things became tense when my mother-in-law arrived. With a smile, she casually said that my home would now belong to her son and started walking through the rooms, thinking about which one she might take. She even mentioned, "I wonder if this room would be good for me." I kindly told her that I was the one inheriting the house, but she wasn't bothered and argued that because I was married to her son, everything I had belonged to him. She said, "So, in a way, this house is his, right?" Her cheerful attitude felt out of place, especially since I was grieving. She even suggested we should start getting along better, as if she was planning to move in soon. I was frustrated and couldn't understand why she would bring this up now. This house was full of memories of my parents, and her claim over it felt like a threat. I thought back on my life. I'm 44 years old and almost gave up on marriage at 41, but then I met Jack, who's 5 years younger than me. We connected through a mutual friend, and Jack always respected my opinions, including when we planned our honeymoon. He initially suggested Europe, but when I preferred the Maldives, he happily agreed. However, things got tricky when Jack mentioned his mom wanting to live with us because his dad was getting sicker. Even though I understood her situation, Jack and I had agreed before marriage that we wouldn't live together. I reminded him of this, and he promised to talk to his mom. Through all of this, it became clear I needed to stand my ground to protect my family home. Jack saw my concerns and agreed to support me in making sure our home wasn't overtaken by his mother. Meeting a wonderful person like Jack always brings happiness, but it also brings a sense of loss. My dad passed away 4 years before I married. He never saw my wedding or got to reassure him about my future. My dad was a disciplined executive at a small company, and I respected him a lot for how he supported our family, even though the company wasn't large. This respect grew even more as I started my own career, learning about the struggles in the workplace. 3 years into my marriage, my mother passed away. Jack was incredibly supportive during this time. "Are you okay? Maybe you should rest a little," he said, always looking out for me. At the funeral, we decided to hold it at our family home, which felt more personal than holding it at a funeral home. Having Jack by my side during the funeral gave me comfort, and I was grateful for his understanding and care. But things changed when my mother-in-law, Ava, arrived. She gave me her condolences, which I accepted politely. Our relationship had been okay but distant because we didn't live together and only saw each other occasionally. During the funeral, Ava seemed unusually cheerful, which felt off. She thanked me for my help with the funeral, saying it went well because of my efforts. Then, suddenly, she said, "The funeral's over, let's drop the formalities." I was surprised, thinking her earlier kindness was genuine, but then she started commenting on how nice the house was. I mentioned that some parts weren't tidy, but she dismissed it with a wave and walked deeper into the house. She said, "My son will inherit this house. I wonder if I should take this room." I was unsure how to react, but it became clear that her earlier kindness wasn't real. She was trying to claim my family home. During a tense moment, I reminded Ava that I was the one inheriting the house. She smirked and said, "I know your parents had no other children, and a wife's things belong to her husband, right? So, this house really belongs to my son, doesn't it?" Her comment frustrated me, and with an unsettling cheer, she said, "Let's get along better from now on," and announced her plan to take one of the rooms for herself. Alarmed, I asked, "Does this mean we'll be living together?" Without hesitation, she said, "Exactly. This beautiful house would be a waste with so many empty rooms, and I won't have to take care of my husband alone." This all happened shortly after my mother passed away, and her insensitivity only made my frustration grow. Why would she say that now, of all times? Just then, Jack overheard and stepped in. "Mom, what are you doing? This isn't the time for this," he scolded her. Unfazed, she replied, "Why make such a big deal?" Jack firmly asked her to leave and apologized to me afterward. "Sorry, my mom can be unreasonable," he said. I appreciated his support and replied, "It's okay, thanks for handling it." But as we moved forward after the funeral and discussed the future of my family home, I noticed a subtle shift in Jack's attitude. 12 days after my mother's funeral, Jack and I were talking about moving out of our cramped apartment. "This place is getting too small. Don't you think we should move back to my parents' house?" I suggested. He agreed, saying, "Yeah, you're right. With the possibility of having kids and needing more space, it would be better than staying here." But then he hesitated and added, "Well, we should start getting ready for the move." As we started talking about the details, he said something that caught me off guard. Considering how big the house is and all the empty rooms, I thought maybe my parents could move in with us. I was shocked and asked, "Are you saying we should live together?" Recently, I had noticed a change in Jack. Even though he used to respect my opinions, I now felt like he was just agreeing with me without really thinking things through. I started wondering if he was just going along with whatever his mother wanted. His willingness to accommodate her was becoming more obvious, and it made me question whether he was still the supportive partner I thought he was. His suggestion to live with his parents made me wonder if he was serious about what I wanted. even though I had made it clear that I didn't want to live with them. He seemed to keep siding with his mother. "Haven't I told you that we're not living together?" I kept reminding him. His usual response was, "But Mom keeps insisting." I reminded him of how he had stood up to her at the funeral when she behaved inappropriately. "You opposed living together then, didn't you?" I asked. He agreed, saying, "Yes, I was upset about her barging in, but that doesn't mean I'm completely against living together. I just didn't think such an important decision should be rushed." At the funeral, he had seemed to back me up at first, but now I was seeing that maybe his feelings were more aligned with his mother's. Jack also seemed to avoid making firm decisions, possibly thinking that staying neutral would keep him out of trouble. This was frustrating for me. I'm completely against living with someone who walked into my parents' house during the funeral and acted like they owned the place. I said, "Please make sure your mother understands this." He sighed. "Why does it bother you so much?" "Fine, I'll tell her." After seeing how my mother-in-law acted at my mother's funeral, I couldn't even imagine sharing the home my father had built with her. The idea was unthinkable to me now. What made it worse was that Jack wasn't taking a strong stance and was letting his mother's demands guide his decisions. My mother-in-law confronted me directly, asking, "Why are you so opposed to living together in such a big house? You're Jack's wife now, and his father and I are practically your parents too. Why fight it?" I repeated my refusal to live with my in-laws, explaining the difficulties of managing everything on my own, especially with Jack's mobility issues. My mother-in-law accused me of abandoning them, but I reminded her of the practical reasons I'd already discussed. Although I sympathized with my father-in-law's health problems, the thought of being overwhelmed by extra responsibilities made the idea of living together unthinkable. If it ever came to that, I made it clear that a significant change in both Jack's and his mother's attitudes toward my needs and boundaries was non-negotiable. A few days later, I was surprised to see Jack rearranging our living room. "What's going on? Are we packing up for the move?" I asked. He responded, "No, I'm making space for 2 beds." The mention of 2 beds made my heart sink. I cautiously asked, "Are your parents moving in?" He said, "No, they're moving in today." I was shocked. Despite my objections, it seemed like Jack and his mother had already decided on cohabitation without consulting me. "Why is this happening?" I asked, feeling frustrated. He explained, "Their lease is up, so we decided they'd move here instead of renewing it. It'll be cramped, but we're moving soon, right? Just bear with it." I reminded him, "That's not what I meant. Why is living together even an option? I've made it clear I don't want to live with someone who barged into my parents' house during the funeral and suggested taking over a room." He promised to talk to his mom and said, "We'll be living together now, so please try to get along." Annoyed, I asked, "Why do you prioritize everything she says?" He tried to explain, "It's not about prioritizing her. I listened to both of you." But it was obvious he couldn't resist his mother's influence. Believing he was making decisions independently, I'd always seen him as kind, but around his mom, he acted like a different person, putting me in an unwanted situation. As my in-laws settled into our already cramped apartment, my mother-in-law began complaining about the conditions. I apologized, saying we'd manage until we could find a bigger place. My father-in-law, Peter, seemed polite at first, but it quickly became clear he would follow my mother-in-law's lead, turning into another person who just went along with her wishes. A few days later, my mother-in-law asked me to run an errand for her, buying a medicated patch. It was a small task, but it added to my growing frustrations. As the situation continued to worsen, the idea of living together became unbearable. My mother-in-law was excited about the space and comfort she'd get from the move, but what she didn't know was that I was quietly making preparations to protect my childhood home and its memories. After about 12 days of silence, I made a drastic decision. I officially renounced my inheritance and secured court approval to give up my rights to the property. When I told my family, I explained, "This house means so much to me. I couldn't bear the thought of you living there, so I've decided to let it go. I'll keep it in my heart as a beautiful memory." My mother-in-law was furious. "What madness possessed you? You could have sold it for a lot of money. Why just abandon it?" I stayed calm and replied, "Selling it would only make you rely on that money. I thought it would be clearer if I had nothing to do with it." She was outraged. "We moved out of our place for this. How are you going to make it up to us?" I stood firm, saying, "I've always opposed living together. You forced this situation on us without a proper discussion, so I took a stand." The revelation left my husband and mother-in-law shocked, their faces pale, and they couldn't find the words to respond. My father-in-law looked on, confused by everything happening. I turned to Jack and said, "I've been thinking about getting a divorce. What do you think?" He stammered, clearly taken aback. "A divorce?" Before he could say more, my mother-in-law shouted, "Jack, you should divorce this ridiculous wife immediately." Her demand for a divorce was harsh but expected, a test of whether Jack would make an independent choice in this moment. Jack hesitated, and I saw his uncertainty. I became resolute and said, "Fine, if that's what you want, let's go ahead with the divorce. My father-in-law tried to intervene, saying, Jack, it can't be helped. Your mom insists. Jack finally spoke, though reluctantly. Well, you seem to want a divorce too, and maybe that's for the best. Even in this moment, it was clear that Jack, along with his father, could not stand up to my mother-in-law's strong will. He seemed to think that agreeing with her was a way to avoid conflict. I sighed, resigned yet determined, and said, all right, let's proceed with the divorce. I'll move out with just a few things. That night, I stayed in a budget hotel, knowing there were urgent tasks ahead. The next day, I took a half-day off from work and went to the courthouse to take care of things. A few days later, my mother-in-law called, agitated. What's going on? It seems that house is now becoming yours. Why the sudden change? She demanded, probably having learned about my decision through the estate division process. I could feel the tension in the air as my mother-in-law lashed out, accusing me of forgery and deceit. I stood my ground, calmly explaining, the documents are legitimate. Why would I forge anything for court submission? Her anger intensified, pressing further. Then why is the house becoming yours when you were supposed to renounce it? I replied, right after I submitted the renunciation. I withdrew it. It's possible to retract the application before it's processed, and I chose to do that. I let you believe I had relinquished it to gauge reactions and decide my next steps, particularly regarding the divorce. Her face twisted with frustration as she tried to salvage what she could, asking about the property division. Since it was acquired before the divorce, it should be split, right? She asked. I calmly explained, no, it's an inherited asset, so it's exempt from property division. She continued, trying to probe for more, asking about how Jack could potentially benefit from the property division. I responded, we've only been married a few years, so the division of inherited assets would be minimal, if anything. Despite her accusations and attempts to twist the situation, I remained firm. I'm protecting this house because it holds precious memories of my parents. I reiterated, I don't want people like you living there. If you have further complaints, take them to a lawyer. The divorce proceedings moved swiftly after that. My mother-in-law's insistence on speeding up the process was evident, and regardless of her motivations, the divorce was finalized. It felt like a weight had been lifted from my shoulders, knowing I had successfully safeguarded my father's home from potential disruption. After I moved out, I could only imagine how my ex-in-laws must have struggled with the cramped space. My former mother-in-law started searching for new living arrangements, but the realities of aging and the hurdles of passing rental screenings made it difficult. Eventually, my ex-husband found a small single-family home for them, a downgrade in size, no doubt, and likely more expensive than their previous apartment, but it offered them their own space, and he took on the responsibility of supporting them. The dream of moving into my parents' large house was shattered for my former mother-in-law, who had to settle for a much smaller home. It was a humbling experience for her, though I couldn't say I felt sorry for her. As for me, I found solace in the house that my parents left behind. Despite everything that happened, it felt like a sanctuary, warm, full of memories, and almost as if my parents were still with me in spirit. The new chapter one began in that home felt like a fresh start, free from the burdens and tensions that had plagued my life.